ABC News.
Hello and welcome to Afternoon Briefing here on ABC News. I'm Patricia Karvelas. It's great to have your company. Coming up, should a hard border be placed around Victoria? I'll be joined by the Australian Medical Association's Vice President. But first, here are the top stories we're following today. Concerns over Victoria's increasing infection rate as 75 new cases are reported overnight.
You're not immune from catching coronavirus by virtue of the postcode that you live in.
The New South Wales Labor MP whose home was raided by federal agents says he's the subject of a political witch hunt. And Beijing accuses Australia of ramping up a campaign of espionage against China. Victoria has recorded 75 new cases of coronavirus overnight, the highest daily jump since March. 14 of the cases are linked to existing outbreaks, 37 are from routine testing and 23 remain under investigation. Authorities are still considering imposing localised lockdowns.
Clearly, big numbers today are absolutely concerning, and a lot of these are all of the settings that we've seen in recent days. So outbreaks occurring across multiple households, across work and other settings, but we know what will turn this around, and it's people stepping forward for testing but also isolating when they've got symptoms. What we're seeing is transmission across settings because people are still going out with symptoms. So whether or not it needs a legal direction, I think, is a conversation to be had over the next couple of days. We're not there yet, but we do know that the solution is there already, which is people not having unnecessary contacts across multiple households, across multiple settings. That will control transmission. What is encouraging is that we're finding so much that's out there. We've had 50% coverage in some of our hotspot suburbs. That will effectively find and isolate all of the transmission in those places. But we have to bear in mind that there are people still moving about, and it only takes one to go to a setting and exposing dozens and dozens of people.
Let's get the latest coronavirus figures with our analyst, ABC analyst Casey Briggs. Casey, 75 new cases overnight. How significant is that spike compared to the last few days?
Patricia, it's clearly not good. You don't need me to tell you that. 75 cases, and up to 74 of them were acquired in Australia. Just look at how quickly this spike has grown. That is clearly exponential growth at this point. Last Monday, for example, 1 week ago, we recorded 16 cases in Victoria. So we're looking at an almost five-fold increase just in the number of cases in the state in a week. So it's big. 75 is the fourth highest number that Victoria has ever recorded in a single day. These three in late March were the biggest, but of course the big difference between then and now is that back then a lot of cases were coming in from overseas. They were being imported still. Now, almost none of them are. So if you just look at the locally acquired infection numbers, Victoria's currently recording the worst locally acquired infection numbers, the biggest spike of locally acquired infections it ever has. The other numbers that we're watching closely are the numbers of unknown source transmissions, those community transmission cases where a source hasn't been found. They have come off a little bit in the last couple of days. Lots and lots of these cases that are being found in the last couple of days have been linked to known outbreaks, but there are also lots still under investigation which could become community transmission. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a big spike in that in the next couple of days as well. But they remain near the worst they've ever been. So things are not great. Hopefully, I guess the other thing I should say is that there's a couple of things complicating this data and how to interpret it at the moment, and that is that we're doing more testing. They're doing more testing in Victoria in targeted locations, and that will necessarily push numbers up. That's a good thing. We catch them earlier is a good thing before they can spread the virus through the community. But also those smaller group rules that took effect last week, we should start to see the effect of that in the data pretty soon, if not already. So that will hopefully start to bring numbers down. But clearly, authorities there are worried. They seem to think numbers will get worse before they get better. Still, we are really sort of on the edge.
Yeah, we certainly are on the edge. You mentioned the increased testing. Brett Sutton just saying there in the clip we played, up to 50% coverage in terms of testing in some of these hotspots. So what happens from here then?
Well, there's a couple of things I'm watching for in the next few days. One, of course, is one of the keys to the success of Australia's handling of this pandemic. One of the things that's helped us crush this curve has been the teams of contact tracers who have been able to track and trace every single infection. Now, at the moment, that team in Victoria, even with reinforcements from New South Wales and Western Australia, are currently managing around 2,500, more than 2,500 close contacts of confirmed cases. And Brett Sutton, the Chief Health Officer, this morning said they're pretty close to the limit of what they can handle. If we exceed the capacity of contact tracing, well, then we have a problem, because we are going to necessarily struggle to track down every single case that is possible. Then what happens next if the numbers get worse? Well, we've heard them talking today about localised lockdowns, presumably localised before you get to a sort of entire of Melbourne or entire state lockdown. But all states and territories are obviously very keen to avoid having to do that. That's a big step backwards. It's something they've been saying from the beginning we only want to do once. And what does that say about future outbreaks if and when they occur? Because, again, even when these numbers come back down again, if they do come down soon, the numbers will still not be zero. So outbreaks can still happen. Outbreaks could happen in New South Wales. If we have to go to lockdowns every time that is the case, even if they are localised, that's going to be pretty fatiguing on everyone, I would have thought. Yeah,
that's right, Casey. Thanks for coming on. For more on this, I'm joined by Dr. Chris Zapala, who's the Vice President of the Australian Medical Association. Welcome to the program. 75 cases overnight. Even with an increase in this testing that we're seeing, did you ever expect Victorian cases to climb like that?
Look, we probably didn't expect it to increase quite as sharply in a relatively short period of time. We always knew there were going to be little waves, and I don't think we need to get sort of stuck on what constitutes a wave and how big they are, because we've clearly got to manage little outbreaks of the virus going forward. But yes, the numbers are a little bit disappointing, if nothing else, and I think it clearly points to the fact that we've relaxed our guard a little bit. This is a tussle, this is a battle that we're in with an infectious virus, and we never need to forget that. And we've got a long way to go with it yet, and we've got to remain vigilant.
You say that we can't relax, we can't be complacent. Why Victoria, though? Because on that premise, there was a relaxing in New South Wales as well in other states. Do you have some analysis on why we're seeing this kind of outbreak in Victoria?
Well, as always, there's going to be a range of reasons for this happening. And remember, there's no rule book here. I actually think as a country, we've done pretty well managing this virus, starting from, remember, an unknown position. This virus is not a known entity to us. So we've done not too badly. As always, there are multiple factors. Clearly, behaviours have been a bit lax. Perhaps hand washing, physical distancing, not as good as it should have been. The amount of testing has obviously been ramped up, as we were just hearing. So we're going to identify more cases and so on, and that's led to an increase in the number of people that we're seeing with the virus. The fundamental principles are that we need to stop people congregating as much as possible, move them apart to reduce that transmission risk, and stop large groups of people coming together. And that's the happy medium that we've got to reach with this virus going forward.
Is it time to close the Victorian border? Given in Melbourne we're seeing these hotspots, Melbourne appears to be where the problem is. Do you think there's a case for closing the border?
Let's wait and see what the public health and the medical advice is on that point. We would be relaxed in the AMA about having to gently increase restrictions again if that's required, if that's what the advice was. We'd be relaxed about reducing movement, obviously, in these hotspot areas. You can see, though, that the overall intent here is we've got to contain this thing. And there you can draw the line in a bunch of different places, but that's the outcome we've got to achieve. And if we want to achieve a relaxed stance with this, then it comes down to the individual behaviours that we all have to put in place. That's what's going to make the biggest difference. Presumably, you don't want to travel into the hotspot anyway. So I think we've got to depend on people to be somewhat sensible with what they're doing here as well. So, those sorts of borders and restrictions are definitely all on the table. And if that's what it takes to reduce movement to keep the numbers low, then so be it. But there are ways to do it if we're all really good with those personal behaviours.
Victorian health officials have flagged suburban lockdowns as a possible option. And just to be clear, this was always on the table. When this crisis started, the Prime Minister actually made it clear that these localised lockdowns might be a solution in the longer term. When do you think that would be an appropriate response? So we're at this number today, over 70 new cases. This is, as Casey Briggs told us, the fourth biggest day of an increase. It's extraordinary, really, given we did that longer lockdown in Victoria. So when do you kind of say it's right to do that now? When is that moment?
Look, that's a really tricky and very reasonable question to ask. And clearly it's a composite of a whole bunch of measures. How much community transmission, for example, is buried in those numbers as opposed to overseas cases brought in? What's the sort of disbursement? What's our contact tracing like? What is the inherent movement in those communities and areas? So I think we have to look at all that data, particularly over the next day or two. And if we're seeing a trend towards higher numbers, towards greater community transmission, then those would be the sorts of things clearly that we're not wanting at all, and that may require the greater restrictions and closures of suburbs and other borders. And I think we've got to accept that option is credible and on the table, and if the numbers don't stack up, then that's where we're headed.
Victoria has adopted a non-invasive test for COVID-19. It requires just a sample of saliva. Certainly sounds more appealing to me, I've got to say. Is this the answer to more people getting tested? It's much less invasive than the previous test.
Look, it's part of the answer. There's no question that the nasal swab, which I concede is a little bit uncomfortable, and the throat swab as well, that's still what we call the gold standard, and so that's still what we should regard as the best test. The saliva test is not too bad, so the literature is suggesting that it's quite reasonable. And as you point out, where testing is so key to identify cases early, isolate people and do contact tracing, that's one of our most effective weapons in this. Then the wider we can get the testing, the better. And if the saliva testing helps us achieve that and makes it a bit more acceptable, then so be it. But still, the PCR test on the nasal and throat swab are the gold standard. So I would see a mixture going forward.
Just on sort of the contact tracing and the sort of investigators that are doing all of this, the COVID-19 app was meant to be a bit of a solution. Do you think what's your assessment of how successful it's been so far?
Well, I guess the honest answer to that is I'm not sure. I'm relaxed about having it on my phone. I think the principle behind it is correct, that we need any tool that might help us with swift contact tracing. If there's a technical problem, then we're going to need the IT boffins to sort that out for us, and that's definitely not going to be me. But the principle is correct, and I'm still very happy to have it on my phone, and I'd encourage other people to as well.
Sure, but that's a different point, right? Is it that, okay, that's the privacy question, but whether it's working is the key part here. Is there any evidence that it is yet?
Well, we need reassurance from the government that it is working. And so I agree that doubt has been around just in the last 24, 48 hours. So let's quickly dispel that. And someone, hopefully in the government, will be able to reassure us all that it is an effective tool still.
Victoria's Chief Health Officer, Professor Brett Sutton, has flagged updated advice on wearing masks as well. Should Victorians be taking that precaution when in public? Given we've got this scenario in Melbourne, is that a good solution?
The AMA has always been comfortable with the advice that we've had in this country that the wearing of masks by well people in the community is not required. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we want to make sure there's enough masks for people who are sick and hospitals and all those sorts of things. But the other, perhaps more relevant and practical reason is that I'd be very concerned that they'd give a false sense of security. As soon as you touch it or wear it for too long, take it on and off, then it's no longer effective. And so if it diverts attention and vigilance away from doing our physical distancing and the other behaviours as well as we should, then we're behind, because we've got that mask on. So I'd much prefer to see it that well people are just doing all those other things that we know, and if you're sick, then you pop a mask on and you go get help.
Thanks so much for joining us. Dr. Chris Zapala is the Vice President of the Australian Medical Association. Let's move on to our other top stories this afternoon. New South Wales Labor MP Shaukat Mosulmain says he has not done anything wrong following allegations Chinese government agents had infiltrated his office. Speaking for the first time since last week's raids on his home and his office, Mr Mosulmain says he is not a suspect in the investigation, but he says he is the subject of a political witch hunt.
I am under no illusion that this is a serious investigation. The first of its kind. Precedents will be set and lives changed. Sadly, the political lynching has already commenced. Let me tell you, I have done nothing wrong.
China's government has used state media to launch an extraordinary attack on Australia, claiming Canberra's spies are waging an intensifying espionage campaign. The patriotic Global Times has run a story which claims that Australia is using diplomatic passports and its embassy in Beijing to spy on China's government. It also claims that a group of Australian agents were arrested in 2018, posting images of items apparently seized from them, including a compass and a map of Shanghai. The claims come during heightened tensions between the two governments and similar claims made of Chinese espionage in Australia. Rex Patrick is a South Australian senator from the Centre Alliance Party. He's been very focused on these issues for some time and he joins us. Welcome.
Good afternoon.
Chinese state media is accusing Australia of ramping up its espionage operations against Beijing. What do you make of those claims?
Oh, look, I have no doubt that all countries engage in some form of spying. I think the difference in relation to the concerns here in Australia are that the Chinese are engaging in influencing Australian politics, and that's something that is a little bit unusual.
An unnamed law enforcement official was quoted saying China would crack down on Australian espionage. Are you worried that Australians living in China could be targeted, for instance, like the writer that's currently being detained?
Yeah, so we have Dr. Yang, for example, who has been detained, and that is always a risk for certainly Australian citizens in China. There has been arbitrary detentions. We've seen that occurring for other jurisdictions as well. Look, I think it's accepted that there is spying activity that takes place across all nations. And, of course, countries always try to, in some way, stop that from happening. So that would just be a normal course of action. As I said, the difference and the problem really we have here in Australia is that of political interference.
Do you see these reports as payback for Australia taking, I suppose, a more muscular stance in relation to China?
Oh, look, there's no question that there has been a deterioration in the relationship. From the moment we called out the Prime Minister called for an international investigation into COVID-19, we've seen things like barley as an export being affected. We've seen meat being affected. We've had calls for Chinese students not to come to Australia for education. We've had claims of racism. There's a general deterioration in the relationship, and that is something that we do need to manage very, very carefully.
Just moving on to another story which also has broken today. On Friday, of course, officers from the Countering Foreign Interference Task Force raided the home and office of the New South Wales Labor MP Shaukat Mosulmain. Now, he says he's not the subject of their investigation. How concerning is this case?
Oh, look, there's no question that there's a serious investigation going on in New South Wales. Look, prima facie, I accept that that he is not the subject of the investigation. Political interference is generally carried out to try and influence politicians. We have a set of laws that were enacted in 2018 in the federal sphere. I note that in New South Wales they have no laws that deal with foreign influence, and maybe that's one of the big lessons that needs to come from this event, and indeed previous events where we've seen, you know, $100,000 floating around in Aldi bags and other forms of influence. Generally, the Chinese state is very well aware that aspirations in the political domain start in the state jurisdictions, and that's where they target things.
In terms of these cyber attacks, the Prime Minister calling out the frequency of attacks, not naming China, but certainly if you talk to the people behind the scenes, they say China is who they're worried about. Do you think he should name China?
Look, my view is that we should call out any state actor that is engaging in cyber warfare here in Australia. It's something that is done by the US, by the UK, by Canada, by the Czech Republic. And it's a way of saying this is unacceptable international conduct and it needs to stop. And the other thing is that when Australians hear that they are under attack, or a cyber attack of some sort, it's really pretty abstract until such time as you know who is conducting the cyber attack. And we need to be part of the solution, which means the government needs to include us in an understanding of the problem.
I want to move on to some economic issues, obviously the economic repercussions of COVID-19. A report from the Grattan Institute says the government should be prepared to spend an additional $70 to $90 billion over the next 12 months to keep the economy afloat. What do you make of that price tag?
Well, there's no question that we can't just stop at the end of September. There are industries that are suffering. So we know that international travel is not going to take place for some time. Even simple things like cinemas reopening, whilst they can potentially reopen under our social distancing rules here in Australia, large companies are not releasing movies because they simply won't get the return on their investment by releasing a movie here in Australia. They need the United States to open back up. Tourism is another area where we're going to have significant unemployment for some period of time. There's a range of industries that will need help. Now, I don't know whether the $70 billion quantum is right. What I do know is that we will have to manage the economy moving forward beyond September.
The government is playing down reports that it's considering a $75 a week increase in the unemployment payment from the old New Start level. What do you think the level should be, and should there be a sort of a temporary issue or it should be a permanent rise?
Well, I think we can't go back to what we had with New Start. The government must appreciate that the number of people that are claiming JobSeeker, moving from the old New Start to JobSeeker, has doubled. And that's not because of any fault of the people that have found themselves on JobSeeker. It's because there are significant job losses right throughout the economy. Trying to go back to a situation where we've got people living on $40 a day, good people that have lost their job through no fault of their own and will be unable to get a job, they simply can't expect those people to live below the poverty line. It was a problem before COVID, and it can't be allowed to continue after.
Are you disappointed that the review into JobKeeper and JobSeeker payments won't be released until after the Eden-Monaro by-election? Labor says that the timing is no good. It's before the government now. It should be released. What's your view?
Well, my view is always with these things that we should allow these reports that are paid for by the public and they're written for public purpose to be released to the public to have a look at. They shouldn't be timed around any political event like a by-election. Let the report be seen publicly. Let the criticism, let the compliments flow. That's the way you get the best policy.
I want to just turn to the outbreak we're seeing in Victoria. You contracted coronavirus but never had symptoms. Do you think the fact that this is such a mild disease for so many people has bred complacency?
Look, I think the success that we've had has to some degree bred some level of complacency, and I also understand in Victoria there may have been some language barriers around the messaging for government, and that needs to be fixed. I've seen just in the streets of Adelaide, and remembering that Adelaide or South Australia hasn't had a new case for some period of time, where people are very relaxed and perhaps more so than they should be.
How alarmed are you by the spike in the cases in Victoria and the broader conversation now that started around border closures?
Look, I think we need to take these outbreaks seriously. I think hopefully we can target measures around those outbreaks rather than go back to whole of state economies being shut down. So we need to take it seriously, and we need assistance from the general public in following medical advice to make sure that we reduce our chances of going to a state-wide economic shutdown again.
Okay, you've given us an indication already of how you feel actually on that, but just very specifically, your state of South Australia committed to reopening its borders on July 20. Should Victoria be excluded from that?
Well, if they have a significant outbreak, then my answer to that is yes. Again, I think we'll find that the medical officials that have been making these decisions will come up with the right solution. The only thing I think that they need to do is make sure that their advice is made public so that it is subject to scrutiny but to be followed.
And on the COVID Safe app, I know there were concerns about it. What's your take on whether that's being effective so far?
Well, there have been some adverse reports. I'm not surprised. You might recall when the app first came out, I raised concerns, and subsequently the Senate has been provided with the testing data. We know that on the 26th of April, which is when the application was released, fundamentally it was not working. And I'm very disappointed with officials. I'm very disappointed with government ministers who came out beating the COVID safe drum when they knew that it wasn't working. And I think that involves a level of dishonesty that leads to a situation where the boy cries wolf. Next time around, people simply won't listen to government. We've got to make sure that if the application is not working, say so. Let's understand what its deficiencies are. And I say that in support of the application. I think the application, the COVID Safe app, actually will do some good if there was a second wave. Yeah,
but at the start, of course, as you know, the Prime Minister's messaging was download the app if you want restrictions to ease. Seems that nexus isn't quite worked out that way.
Well, I think that nexus was actually quite misleading. I think the Prime Minister ought to apologise for misleading the Australian public. He knew the DTA that was developing the app. They knew that it wasn't working in the case of Apple to Apple or Apple to Android in circumstances where the phones were locked, which is of course where the phones spend most of their time. And yet they pressed on focusing on numbers of downloads, and that's irrelevant if the application wasn't working. They should have been honest with the Australian people.
Senator, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
That's the South Australian Centre Alliance Senator Rex Patrick. Time now for business with David Chow. And David, how did the markets finish up today?
Well, in one word, well, few words, not very good today, PK, but it could have been a lot worse. So the ASX 200, well, let's start with the Australian dollar. That went up slightly to 68.8 US cents, but still a big come down from last week when it was pushing 69.5 US cents. But the Australian share market finished sharply lower. It lost 89 points, down 1.5%. But earlier in the day, it fell as low as 2%. So it came off its lows of the day, but still a pretty bad result overall. And basically, it's wiped out 2 weeks worth of losses. We're back to where we were in mid-June. So 8 out of 10 stocks on the 200 index in the red, and utilities and energy the worst performing sectors because of a big drop in oil prices. As for what did well, a company called Fisher & Paykel Healthcare, it surged 7% because it's one of the rare companies which says it's posting a big profit. You don't hear that very much these days during this pandemic. So it's due to demand for its hospital equipment to treat COVID-19 patients. And then gold miners are also doing very well. Many of the top performers were gold stocks, and that's because gold prices are around a 7.5-year high, which is a sign that investors are feeling very nervous about the economic recovery. And then as for what did very badly, the big miners and the big banks. So we have like Fortescue Metals down 3%, NAB down 1.5%. They were the biggest drags on the market. Travel stocks got smashed again when you have Qantas, Webjet and Flight Centre down 5%. I guess it doesn't help that Victoria has been posting double-digit COVID cases growth in the last few days, which is, I guess, raising doubts about reopening plans across state borders.
Yeah, that's no doubt part of the story. Now, the regional airline Rex has announced big expansion plans. It now wants to fly passengers across the 3 capital cities. What's the latest on that story?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, PK, because it's a tiny bit player that only currently services the regional areas, and it wants to compete in the big league now against Qantas and Virgin Mark II when it eventually gets rescued. So Rex basically wants to launch flights in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane from March next year. So that's only less than a year away. So it's basically, it's based in Queensland now, and it's servicing only regional areas, and it's estimated that it'll cost $30 million for this expansion, in which it'll have to buy 5 to 10 new very small airplanes. They haven't worked out how they'll be raising the money yet. They're still thinking about that, whether it's a cash injection from a private equity firm or issuing further bonds. Interestingly, a few weeks ago, Rex was estimating this could cost $80 million. So, you know, their estimate of the price has really dropped a lot. So we'll see whether how much it actually does cost in the end if it does go ahead with this expansion. So the timing is also very interesting too, when the whole aviation sector is suffering. Last week we had Qantas sacking 6,000 workers and forecasting international flights won't resume until July next year. And then we have Virgin that's on track to be taken over by Bain Capital, subject to what happens in the second creditors meeting in August. It'll return as a much more slimmed down airline, and state reopening plans could face hiccups because of the surge in Victorian coronavirus cases. So it is a bit of a risky strategy buying new aircraft in the middle of a pandemic. So I guess the reasoning is strike while the competitors are weak. But Rex itself hasn't been immune from these aviation pressures.
No, that's right. David, speak to you soon. The pandemic has wreaked havoc on the sporting world, and just when things were starting to return to normal, Victoria's spike in cases has thrown the AFL fixture into disarray. The Queensland Government has changed their quarantine requirements for AFL players to restrict interactions with Melbourne teams. Queensland-based teams who play in Melbourne or against a Melbourne-based team in Queensland must now quarantine for 14 days after the match.
And all our decision making and the development of our strict protocols has been anchored in the advice of government and the chief health officers, and it will continue to do so. We also said at the start of this season that it will be a season like no other, and that we're going to have to be flexible and agile throughout this season in order to play all 144 games for the season plus finals that remain when we resumed. Is why we changed the length of quarters and reduced the length of the season.
For more on this, I'm joined by ABC Grandstand commentator Tony Armstrong. Tony, nice to speak to you. This must be a huge problem for the AFL.
Yeah, well, they got 3 rounds away after the reboot of the season, and then obviously the 75 cases overnight forced the Queensland Government's hand, and you just heard about the restrictions that are going to be on Queensland teams. And, well, of course, the first team who's going to be, I guess, put into quarantine is going to be the Gold Coast Suns. They're slated to play this Sunday against the Geelong Cats, and what that means is this round is going ahead, but the fixture does change because they're now going to have to stay here in Melbourne. So the fixture's up in the air, and the AFL headquarters are, I guess, scrambling, trying to work out what it means, not just for next weekend, but the rest of the season.
Is there any chance Victorian teams will move out of the state?
Well, we've already got 2 confirmed going over to the Western Australian hub. That's Collingwood and Geelong. So I think it's likely that we'll see more Victorian clubs go, given down here in Victoria we do seem to be the COVID capital. And we did hear Gil McLachlan in his press conference earlier today state that, I guess, facilities pending any state or territory is a viable option.
And will the grand final be hosted at the MCG this year then?
Well, depending on whether or not they can break, I guess, the agreement they do have with the MCG, they've got an agreement to play the grand final there until 2057. If they can break that, I think it's becoming more and more likely, given it looks unlikely that we'll have a packed house there. And we hear Mark McGowan speak almost every time he has a press conference about wanting to bring the grand final over west and play at Perth Stadium in front of 60,000 fans. So watch that space.
I'm totally watching that space. What a long contract, but that's a whole other story. Hey, thanks for coming on, Tony.
No worries.
ABC grandstand commentator Tony Armstrong there. The Prime Minister has called on states to continue easing restrictions, insisting the country's economy cannot remain stalled. Scott Morrison says the reopening of the borders will support jobs and growth, especially in Queensland.
The people who would be the biggest losers from that border not opening up are the people of Queensland. The people of Queensland need their economy to refire and to resurge. There are Queenslanders who aren't in jobs which need their borders open. And I've been very consistent in advocating to all the premiers and chief ministers, regardless of what side of politics they come from, that it's important to get these borders open.
Time now for my political panel. Liberal MP Andrew Laming is one of my guests, so is Labor MP Stephen Jones. Welcome to both of you. Andrew, I want to start with you. Cases are continuing to climb in Victoria. Alarming numbers today, everyone agrees with that. Why does the government want Queensland and other states to reopen their borders? Do you really want Victorians in Queensland?
The economy has to restart, Patricia, and these borders should never have been closed in the first place. Closing borders doesn't treat COVID, and while it's all wonderful to cocoon and think that the disease is all on the other side of the border, the reality is the economy needs to keep going, and there's already tens of thousands a day of vehicles crossing this border anyway. The border is not closed, it's just closed to economic activity from tourists with fat wallets, but everyone else seems to cross because they've got an essential excuse. So these borders aren't closed, they're just closed to the group that we should at least be closing them to. That's the long and the short of it. Victoria's definitely got a second wave, there's no doubt about it, and we're going to have to see heightened contact tracing like Victoria's never done it before. Remembering that both Victoria and Queensland had the same number of overseas COVID cases to start this whole crisis off, and Victoria today ends up having twice as many cases as Queensland, purely due to community transmission that they could not contain, that other states managed to.
Just let's get clear on this. Regardless of the numbers in Victoria, you think the border should open to Victorians?
Oh, the borders should have always been open. They should.
Sure,
there was no evidence for
okay, looking to the future, I want to pin you down on this. I mean, just say the figures were, 200, 300 tomorrow. They're not, just to be clear. We report news here. But hypothetically, would you argue then that the Queensland border should still be open to Victorians?
100,000 Victorians could charge over the border tomorrow, and the odds of a single case coming into Queensland is around 18%, with the possibility they might infect 1.1 other people. About 2% likely that 2 would come in the next 2 months with 100,000 Victorians. That's the odds. So you've got to say, as a nation, we fight this disease, and go back to the science, Patricia. Keep 1.5 metres away, hygiene, sanitation, distancing, no congregating, and the disease won't spread. But as long as there's places where it does, that will spread. And tourists typically coming over the border, they take an apartment somewhere and they walk down the beach. So they're not engaged in intergenerational disease spread. They're not crowding into Westfields and shopping. They typically go somewhere along the Queensland coast and have a holiday on their own. It's not a high-risk activity.
I can report it's very cold in Victoria this morning. Stephen, you're in New South Wales. Do Victorians need to be kept out of your state? The Premier hasn't shut that border, but has said Melburnians aren't welcome.
Well, look, I think Australians, as soon as it is safe, want to be able to enjoy a holiday somewhere warmer, whether it's northern New South Wales or somewhere in Queensland. But we've got to be led by the science on this, and I frankly find it extraordinary that on the day that Victoria has recorded its the 75 new cases, and it appears like the trend is going upwards, we're getting such mixed messages out of a government MP. And frankly, it's the inconsistencies and the mixed messages which I think are so concerning. That's how we started this. It took us a while to get on the right footing. I think we need clear messages, and we need messages coming from the medical officers, the chief medical officers of our states and nationally, and not from MPs like me and Andrew. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, Andrew was criticising the Black Lives Matter protests. He's criticising people who gathered for a protest and saying they were irresponsible. But here we are today, him using the megaphone, and everybody else, it seems, from his side, using the megaphone of government to protest against all of those states who are taking a more cautious approach. I just don't think that's responsible.
Andrew, I want to ask you about the COVID Safe app. Do you think it's been effective in contact tracing?
I don't have information yet from the states as to who's used it. It's up to states to ask for data off the COVID app. I'd be interested to know if any cases have been yet identified. As you know, millions have downloaded it. I want to see it working. Just responding to Stephen, I am Mr Science. All I ever talk about is the science, Stephen, and we're allowed to shoot the breeze here and reflect on the science without speaking against the Chief Health Officer. My point is that we should be red zoning particular areas in Victoria, which is exactly what the public health directives allow, but the borders themselves, Stephen, don't make any difference if someone crosses over in a ute from one state to the other. The difference is you red zone a small area, you don't close down an entire state of 7.5 million people because you've got 50 cases. You deal with those directly. That's the public health evidence.
I want to change to another topic. I've got so many topics today. I know that the Greens are calling on the government to release the names of the regional media outlets that are going to be receiving funding under that announcement that was made today. I want to stay with you if I can, Andrew Laming. Should those names be provided? It seems reasonable that we should know who is going to get the money.
Seems reasonable. I'm not up on that one, PK. I'd love to learn a bit more about
Just
what
go with
the issue is there with
then.
not releasing the names.
Just go with transparency.
Let's go transparency, but no, I can't answer. I can't reflect on that one, no.
Wouldn't it be good to know?
Yeah, why not?
OK, I'm glad we settled that so easily. Stephen Jones?
100%. If public money is going out to support media outlets, we need to know the basis on which it was provided, and the public has got a right to know. Is money going to certain media outlets and not other media outlets, and what was the basis on which those decisions were made? We know from the very get-go that the scheme was designed to exclude media outlets that the government didn't like. So I think there is a very high public interest in knowing where the money has gone, to whom and how much.
I want to talk about job seeker, job keeper, the economic dimensions of this crisis. Andrew Laming, do you think that the job seeker payment should be increased permanently by $75?
You can pick a number out to PK. I think that the government is going to have to decide two things from each end. Does it go back to where it was? But secondly, what do they do with that surplus money? So there's an argument that we need to be encouraging job seekers to seek out work, and that the current levels are actually providing some moral hazard where people don't seek work. One possibility is that for some of that job seeker, it becomes a job benefit, which is released once someone is employed to incentivise in a weak economic phase new employment. We've got a job keeper challenge as well, with a large number of firms that don't need JobKeeper receiving it. There's a number that, if they were to lose it, would go out of business. So it's exquisitely complicated. It's going to be painful no matter what the government does. And in answer to your question, I don't have a view on how much of the extra job seeker is left with job seekers. I want them to seek work and to get a job, and that will always be the government's priority.
Sure, but you want it to be higher than the old New Start rate?
I'm not locking into that at all. You won't get me saying anything about where it'll end up.
Why?
I want to make sure that some of the surplus job seeker paid gets people back into work, and the one way to do that is what we already have, which is a up to $10,000 bonus for taking a person who's struggling to get a job as a employer incentive.
Sure, Andrew, but we have to actually
wage.
be realistic. We're in a recession. The jobs aren't there. This isn't people being, resistant to taking jobs. They're just not in the economy for them to take.
But I know they're going to come back as well, and you're right, we don't know how many. So it's really complicated, and some job seekers will just dash out and find a job. Others, 12 months from now, aren't going to have any work, and we've got to find a middle ground. You can't have different rules for different job seekers. So this is an important debate. How much do you change job seeker payments, if at all? But more importantly, how much can a job seeker keep in an incentive to find work, particularly if it's paid directly to an employer, it actually creates more working hours. And ultimately the principle is to distribute the nation's working hours, which are only so many, evenly through the population, because Australia only needs, as a single adult, working about 6 hours a fortnight, and for a couple about 14 hours a fortnight to hit the poverty line. That's the lowest number of hours in the OECD to get out of poverty. So getting a job is critical in this phase.
Stephen Jones, Labor says the figure should be higher, but you haven't settled on what you think it should be. Why shouldn't it remain at the double rate?
Look, I think we need to get the evidence that has been provided to government. You might recall, PK, that a few weeks ago the Treasury Secretary said that we've got to look at the job seeker and the job keeper together. The analysis that they've provided government in this secret report no doubt goes through the data on all of these issues. I think it's another reason why we need to have that report released as soon as possible. There is no conceivable reason why the government is waiting till after the by-election in Eden-Monaro to release that report. They should be releasing it this week. They've got it. And we should be having an informed debate. The people of Eden-Monaro should be voting with the knowledge of what the government is going to do with these two critical payments. And after all, that's an electorate, that's an area, that's a region that has been devastated by bushfire, in some parts of it by flood, and now by COVID-19. I can't think of an area in Australia which has got more at stake in knowing what the future of both of those payments are than Eden-Monaro. Why doesn't the government release the report that it's sitting on? Why doesn't it release it this week? Andrew,
that's the question, I suppose. I know that the report is before the Treasurer, so why shouldn't it be publicly released?
Well, it's a bit of a straw man from Andrew. The government was very clear back in March. This is 6 months of security, both for employers and for the job seekers, running for 6 months, reviewed once if there are any errors that we needed to tighten up, but running until the end of September, potentially longer, and the legislation all year. So we're not going to be drawn into a pre-election, fight with the Labor Party about trying to unravel these schemes when we're not even halfway through them. The review's July, they run to the end of September, and Australians have that certainty. They have that certainty.
You've already unravelled them. Already unravelled them. You unravelled them for the childcare workers.
We're going to have to park that one, if you don't mind. Stephen Jones, here I am. Let's just park that one. The government's made a decision and clearly Labor's very critical of it. We'll see what the electorate thinks. The Australian Federal Police are investigating a disinformation campaign about the Labor candidate for Eden-Monaro, which falsely claimed she had quit the by-election race. Stephen, how concerned are you by this?
Oh, look, this is really terrible, dirty tricks campaigning. I don't know whether it's come from the Liberal Party or whether it's come from people sympathetic to the Liberal Party, but it's got no place in modern politics. I think it needs to be roundly condemned, and I think we need to get to the bottom of where it's come from. Not for the first time has this sort of dirty campaigning occurred in the midst of a tight campaign. I'd like to see the Prime Minister out there condemning this and saying that this is the bottom of the barrel and we should be fighting this campaign over issues that matter, like the future of JobSeeker and the future of JobKeeper and jobs for Eden-Monaro, not playing these low-rent games that appear to have been played by Liberal Party sympathisers.
Andrew, the Liberal candidate for Eden-Monaro, Dr Fiona Copvoys, condemned the emails as offensive and inappropriate. Is this a threat to our democratic process?
Was your question, should it be part of?
Well, should it be condemned? I mean, this is pretty outrageous kind of behaviour, isn't it?
Yes, and look, I've seen some of this on social media myself. It was horrific. It was easily discarded as being false, what I saw. I guess the message is, if you're going to engage in fake news, be good at it. This was ridiculous, terrible and not believable.
Just don't do it?
And I think that everyone should stand up against it because it's, you see it all over the world. People have a crack on social media, and it's good to see that those that run social media are starting to crack down on it as well. That's a positive sign as well.
Stephen, you piped up there. Just don't do it. Yes, don't be good at it. I don't think we're instructing anyone to be good at it, though, are we, Andrew Lemming?
I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek.
I realise that, just clarifying for our viewers that no one thinks it's a very good idea. Not so much it's illegal and it's clearly wrong. I want to thank you both for coming on the show. We'll see what happens at that by-election. So many issues swirling around. Thanks for talking to me.
Great to be with you.
Pleasure.
Liberal MP Andrew Laming and Labor MP Stephen Jones joining me there to talk about some of those big stories, including the COVID Safe app, the border closures. You heard Andrew Laming there. He's been a strong advocate for a while now, saying that the borders should not be closed. He said it doesn't mind how many cases there are in Victoria. He thinks the borders should be open. Well, health authorities are confident saliva tests for COVID-19 are accurate enough now to roll out. Melbourne's Doherty Institute has developed the new test, which is being fast-tracked to hotspots. Questions have been raised about the accuracy of the tests, with the New South Wales government declaring it will stick to the original swab kits for now. However, Deputy Chief Medical Officer Nick Coatsworth says State and Territory Chief Health Officers support the use of the saliva test.
It remains the preferred option to have a nasal test. The salivary test is perhaps slightly less accurate. That might be marginal, but because this is a world first that we're rolling out in Victoria, the Victorian Public Health Laboratories and the Doherty Institute are doing some real-time testing on whether these salivary tests are the way to go. But there has been already some preliminary testing that we've reviewed at the AHPPC that suggests that the accuracy is sufficient for it to be rolled out, and it'll be great for people like kids who can't really tolerate the nasal swab.
For more on this, I'm joined by the Director of the Infectious Diseases at Mater Health Services in Queensland, Dr. Paul Griffin. Dr. Griffin, thanks for your time. How significant is this new saliva test? It's sort of changing the way we do testing.
I think any additional capability for testing is obviously really important. Testing is a huge part of why we've been so successful, and also getting the current spike in Victoria under control. And this benefit of this test is many. I believe it's much less invasive, so potentially children, for example, or people that didn't really like the nasal swab might be able to get this one done. And I think there's also a potential for less PPE to be used by the people administering this test. So I think it's a big step forward.
Why is it that we're seeing in Victoria this spike? I mean, some people calling it a spike, some saying it's clearly a second wave. What do you identify as the reasons behind this?
I think there are many, and I think this is what COVID's going to do. If we relax a little bit, if we get a little bit complacent, it's very easy for this virus to start to spread. And, I think there's been a number of reasons why that's been the case in Victoria. I think it's really important to point out, though, that a lot of really good measures have been implemented very swiftly. We're yet to really see the impact of those, because the people diagnosed today weren't infected today. They were infected a week or two ago. So hopefully with all those extra things that have been brought in, we'll see these case numbers start to decline soon.
The outgoing Chief Medical Officer, Brendan Murphy, never called for the mandatory wearing of face masks. But given what's happened in Victoria, should people be wearing face masks?
It remains a controversial topic. I don't think so in this country. I mean, I think the use of masks in the healthcare setting is very clear, but using them in the community can actually have some negative impacts if people think they're protected and no longer need to social distance or do their hand hygiene, for example. They could even be increasing their risk. And similarly, if they don't wear the mask properly, if they don't change it properly, if they don't dispose of it properly, it can also create a risk. So I'd like to think people focus on those measures, the social distancing, the hand hygiene, staying home if you're unwell, and get tested. And that's going to be much more effective than trying to use masks.
Now, obviously, there's a big debate about just how to, flatten this again, if you like, in Victoria, or make sure it doesn't spread to other states and territories. What sort of strategies do you think should be used to ensure that it doesn't spread across the country?
Look, I think it's all the strategies we're seeing. So lots of testing. So we find all the cases. We find out where they've come from with all the public health measures, with the contact tracing. We make sure contacts of those people stay quarantined, and hopefully people adhere to that. If people need to get tested, that they do that. And that maybe we look at restricting travel in and out of those really hotspot areas so that we don't risk spreading cases anywhere else. And with all of those measures, we should get this under control fairly quickly, provided people all play their part.
If New South Wales businesses are being advised against serving Melburnians, and the Chief Medical Officer, or the Chief Health Officer rather, says cases will continue to climb, you don't think the borders should be closed off so that Victoria is kind of quarantined in some way?
Look, I think that's a difficult situation. There's no easy answer. I think if the cases keep climbing, then I think we'll have no choice but to restrict travel outside of those areas where there's lots of local transmission. If we get this under control, though, then that may not be necessary. So I think we'll know a lot in the coming days. If cases keep increasing exponentially, then I think we might need some of those broader measures. But hopefully, with what's been introduced, we'll start to see an impact soon.
Globally, we've reached 10 million cases. Are there signs the virus is slowing down anywhere?
I think it's too soon to say that. I think some countries like our own have great control at the moment, but we certainly haven't defeated this virus. It keeps increasing in a lot of parts of the world. So we're far from post-COVID. We're really just at the start of all this, and that's why we need people to keep playing their part to keep it under control.
Yeah, we're certainly not post-COVID. We're very much in the thick of it, and we've seen that in Victoria. I think it's made everyone sort of stand up and think, oh, this isn't over yet. There was a sense that perhaps we'd been successful. Were we too quick, Dr. Griffin, in sort of saying, aren't we amazing?
I think a little bit. I think there was a little bit of complacency, a little bit of, because I even heard the term post-COVID in a lot of media. You know, I think people did think we were completely successful and perhaps, I guess, didn't really appreciate just what we'd avoided by looking at other parts of the world, and also just that this remains an ever-present risk. And if we get a little bit complacent, it's going to come back. And that's going to be the situation for some time.
Yeah, that's right. No doubt it's going to be for some time. This is what you get when you've got a suppression strategy, not an eradication strategy. Was that the wrong decision?
I don't think so. I think an eradication strategy would have been near impossible, if not impossible. I mean, you know, we struggled with some of the restrictions we were under. We're already seeing people not be adherent with those. And obviously there's been an enormous economic and social impact of what we have had. And really, I think we had the balance just right. We've got great control. Hopefully we'll get Victoria back under control fairly quickly and we'll be able to return to near normal life. I think to aim for eradication would have been really tough restrictions for a really long time that people just wouldn't have been able to tolerate.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Dr. Paul Griffin is the Director of Infectious Diseases at Mater Health Services in Queensland, joining us with his analysis. Now to some breaking news, and gunmen have attacked the Stock Exchange building in the Pakistani city of Karachi, killing several people. What we know so far is that 4 gunmen tried to storm the Stock Exchange in the Exchange building in Karachi's financial district shortly after 9 o'clock in the morning. That's local time. The men used firearms and grenades in the attack. Stay tuned to ABC News for more details in the next hour about this attack, which we're just bringing you now. Of course, this news breaking right now. Remember, you can keep up to date on ABC News online or on iView. And Afternoon Briefing is also on iView. So if you missed any of our interviews, and we've had a cracker of a show, we've spoken to a number of people this afternoon, including the Australian Medical Association, for their take on this spike we're seeing in Victoria, whether it's a second wave, what's needed to shut it down, whether border closures are perhaps necessary. Afternoon Briefing is how you find us. Stick around for more on our top stories up next. I'm Patricia Karvelas. I'll be back tomorrow at 4 p.m. with more of Afternoon Briefing, where we'll bring you some of the big issues and the big interviews. Stay with us here on ABC News.
Our life is better